Over the last few days, the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister have both in effect acknowledged that the invasion of Iraq, the occupation of Iraq by the Allied forces, including Australia, is to a substantial extent about oil, about access to energy resources. That's a really crucial thing, because what it demonstrates is that yet again the Howard government has lied to the Australian people. First, the rationale for invading Iraq was about alleged weapons of mass destruction that turned out not to exist. Then, of course, after the fact, the government ran around saying, oh, it's about bringing democracy to Iraq, getting rid of this appalling dictator, spreading freedom and all of those kinds of things. Now it's finally let the cat out of the bag that critical to the whole decision, the American role and by definition the Australian role, is access to energy resources. Now, as a number of people have pointed out in letters to the papers, as a major energy producer, Australia ought to be rather worried about this attitude. If it's okay to go around invading countries in order to secure future energy sources, things like uranium and coal that Australia has in abundance could be the target for the aspirations of other countries in the future. It's not exactly a very sensible position for us to take, even leaving aside the obvious wider moral questions that it involves. Recently, amongst various other books, I've been reading a book by a bloke called Michael Clare called Blood and Oil, which traces US energy policy and foreign policy since the Second World War and shows just how central the need to secure reliable and in particular cheap sources of oil has been to American foreign policy. Clare makes the interesting point that in his view the real driver for the American invasion of Iraq was the need to actually get the Iraqi oil onto the global oil market, because the extent to which America has been able to draw on its own resources to satisfy its ever-mounting demand for oil has been steadily diminishing, and even adjacent countries like Mexico and Canada cannot fill anything like the gap that's rapidly growing between American consumption and American production. So more and more the Americans are reliant on Middle East oil, and Clare makes the argument that what they most wanted to do was to actually get a normal regime in place in Iraq in order to ensure that you could get the Iraqi oil onto the global market. Also, Iraq's strategic position being so close to all the other major sources of oil, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the various small countries in the Gulf, that between them control most of the world's cheap oil reserves. Clare argues that this is the real motivation behind the invasion of Iraq, and he cites a raft of materials, speeches, documents from official sources to justify that. Now, these things will always be contentious, they'll always be debated, but it's interesting from an Australian perspective that the revelations in the Prime Minister's speech, and particularly the unguarded comments of the Defence Minister Brendan Nelson recently, show that whether we like it or not, oil's at the heart of it. That's why we haven't been out there invading Burma, we haven't certainly been invading China, we haven't been invading Zimbabwe, some of the other countries that have got serious human rights issues, but we have invaded and occupied Iraq. The key difference is oil, and the duplicity of the Australian government has been exposed from its own statements.